Okay. Hi, everybody. I want to thank all of you so much for coming. I am just like overwhelmed by the excitement and energy that so many people have brought to this speaker series. And I'm so excited to introduce you all to the first speaker of this series. Khadijah Abdurahman is a child welfare system abolitionist and an independent researcher who studies, in particular, predictive analytics in the child welfare system. She's co-founded a number of organizations and is the director of We Be Imagining, a series of digital programming examining race and technology through infusing academic discourse with the performance arts in partnership with community-based organizations in a number of organizations. Part of the reason that I was really excited about inviting Khadijah was that she has such a clear view of the fairness, accountability, and transparency field in artificial intelligence, and has written really powerfully, persuasively about, I suppose I would say, the wrong motivations and the failures to understand like what the overarching and sort of like final ultimate goals are of presumably about justice work and equity. And I don't know that many researchers who have a very clear big picture view of where we should be going as a community. So I was really keen to just hear her thoughts about anything. And she was fortunately like really, really up for that. So I'm just really, really pleased to be able to introduce as many of you as I can to her work. With that, I'll let Khadijah start with a poem that she selected to read. Khadijah?
Introduction. I'm super excited to be pseudo in San Francisco from vis-a-vis Brooklyn. And so I'm really inspired by the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And I often think about how can we, I don't know, how is rhythm the metric of epistemic authority instead of a lot of the unidirectional models that we're socialized to believe are a form of displaying competence and legitimacy in academia. And so Ali nicely let me kind of co-curate the format of today's events. And so I wanted to start off similarly to how Du Bois starts out Souls of Black Folk with an excerpt from the spiritual strivings, and each chapter with a song. I wanted to start with a poem, and this is from the book Homies by Dana Smith. If you haven't read it, they're an amazing poet. And this poem is called Acknowledgements. I chose it because, in thinking about, and I'll discuss this more in the talk, but in thinking about child welfare as a form of policing, there's aspects of it that draw people's attention to suffering and death. But ultimately, like my project and the work that I'm about is not about Black suffering or Black death, but Black joy, Black resistance, and surviving despite it all. And this poem, Acknowledgements, is about love. And so that's the kind of intention that I wanted to bring into this evening. You saved me half a bag of skins, the hard parts, my fave, dusted orange with hot. You say we can't go to the bar because you taking your braids out. I come over, we watch Medea while we pull you from you. You make us tacos with the shells like I like and you don't. I get too drunk at the party, you scoop my pizza from the sink with a solo cup. All that red, you in the morning, bong water grin, wet chin. You in the lawless dark, laughing like a room of women laugh at a man who thinks his knowledge is knowledge. I text you and you say, I was about to text you, bitch. You cook pork chops same way I do. Our families in another city go to the same church. You rolling a blunt, holding your son is a mecca. You invite me for drag queens on the nights I think of finally. You pull over in Mississippi so I can walk a road my grandfather bled on. You gave me a stone turtle, it held your palm scent for a week. I call your mama. You request like a demand. Make me some of that mango cornbread. I cut the fruit, measure the honey. You and you go in on a dildo for my birthday. You name it Drake. You know me. A year with you in that dirty house with that cracked out cat was a good year. At the function, I feel myself splitting into too many rooms of static. You touch my hand and there I am. Do you want to be a best friend? A box for yes, a box for maybe yes. Did our grandmothers flee the fields of ember so we could find each other here? Friend, you are the war's gentle consequence. I am the prison that turns to rain in your hands. You at my door, the night my father leaped beyond what we knew. The branches of silence stay heavy with your petal. You smell like the milk of whatever beast I am. Your poop is news. Your fart is news. Your gross body, my favorite pop. You drunk as an uncle making all kinds of nonsense sense. I fluent the language between your words. And when we fight, not a ring, but a room with no exit. We spill the blood and bandage the wound, clean cuts with tongues. If luck calls your name, we split the pot. And if you wither, surely I rot. We hate the same people. And before we were messy flesh, I'm sure we were the same dust. Everywhere you are is a church. And I am the pastor, the deacons, the mother fainting at the altar. As long as I am a fact to you, death can do with me what she wants. My body, water, your body, a trailing hands carrying the river to the sea. I ink your name into my arm to fasten what is already there. You may coming out, coming in from the storm. I would love you even if you kill God. You are the country I bloody hills for. You love me despite the history of my hands, their mangled confession. God bless you who screens my news, drafts my breakup text. You are the drug that knocks the bird from my heart. Oh, the horrid friends who were just ships harboring me to you. And how many times have you loved me without my asking? How often have I loved a thing because you loved it, including me, with your ugly ass? At the end of the world, let there be you, my world. And that's Dana Smith. I can't take credit for that. And check out Homies.
Thank you so much. So as part of the this format, I've also selected a poem to read. It's a Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone, for those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Ali. I feel like that's also great intention because I love Audre Lorde and I see that increasingly in the tech space, she's more and more cited. And she also has some toxic, intimate partner violence relationships. And so, I think that's important to remember that even our heroes are flawed. And it's not without redemption. I think ultimately she was striving for love and for repair, but we're all coming here with our flawed issues. And speaking of my issues, most of you know me from Twitter and the podcast, so I know that y'all know that I have ADD. So what's going to happen is I wrote this out in very nice, scripted format, so I can stay on track. But I'll be taking some detours, so bear with me. So the first for the intro. Hello, my name is Khadijah Abdurahman. This talk is called "Calculating the Souls of Black Folk: Predictive Analytics in the Child Welfare System." I'm compelled to tell you a little bit more about myself in the context of Zoom deterritorialization that has become baseline pandemic. Sometimes what we understand in the Black radical tradition as autoethnography feels extractive in the Joshua Bennett sense of the word, how he articulates in the poem In Defense of Henry Box Brown. I too have signed over the rights to all my best wounds. I know the respectable man enjoys a dark body best when it comes with a good cry thrown in. But on the flip side, my ideas are a product of being the events in which I became myself. So with that anxiety, I'll let you know that I'm 32 years old, a relatively cisgendered woman, single mother of 5. I identify as Black and my mother is Irish American. My father is Ethiopian. I'm a monolingual English speaker and a US citizen. Definitely thinking about that lately as a lot of my friends have been dealing with fears of deportation and like a precarity on top of the pandemics that is existing. I'm newly minted into the middle class, but spent much of my adult life under the federal poverty line. My entry point into predictive analytics in the child welfare system was being investigated by the New York City Administration for Children's Services, also called ACS. Although in retrospect, it was the just short of 5 years I spent in residential behavior modification centers from 12 to 17 years old that I began to think about how and why children become separated from their families. I consider myself to be a non-academic academic, meaning in literal terms, I've never graduated from college and only in the most technical sense completed high school, but I've had the privilege and the space to become a scholar. It's not lost on me that being adjacent to whiteness phenotypically as being a light-skinned woman or in the social capital, one can acquire armed with early intimacy of white grammar that has also enabled my access to the front engines of settler colonialism that is academia. You know, while on one hand, I have been arrested, forgotten, hyper-visibilized, degraded, hungry in ways that make navigating reading and intellectual labor easier to navigate in the sense that they're driven by visceral memories of violent foreclosure. The flip side of that is I very much survived despite it all. And the degree to which I seem unique or a symbol of progress is best seen as an illusion because so many more people have been excluded. And so I'm very aware of the fact that I could come to you and share this information about maybe having a violent encounter with the police, but I also need to bring to you that, you know, I have survived for the very same reasons that I've had access to this academic space. So I just want to hold that up. My atypical path has entailed a level of financial precarity, but also being a perpetual outsider allows for a certain freedom to comment and to act controversially without fear of repercussion. Or as I tweeted in the wake of my Medium piece on the moral collapse of AI ethics, I'm not the voice of the voiceless, I'm the voice of the strategically silent. That acknowledgement of living in a liberalism where we're all free to act as we're disciplined to do so is an important touchstone as we go through today's talk. And I also just want to hold that up because, you know, you might have colleagues or friends or peers who are Black who might not feel as comfortable taking some of the risks that I can because either they can't or they really don't want to talk to you about that kind of stuff. Like not all, just because I believe in a relational ethics, part of that is being able to have the freedom to have a little bit of distance. And, you know, so I just want to hold that up. Second is that first I'd like to talk about what I'm not going to talk about, because what's more high key 2021 than making absence into an object as genesis? I'd like for us to decouple the conversation around children's welfare from the conversation about these systems which claim that as their mantle. And actually, I'm realizing now I need to share my screen. 1 second, technical difficulties. You know what? I'm just going to keep it like this so that I don't get confused. And so, actually, maybe I'll start with this. So a lot of times I use the phrase child welfare system because the people who get their kids snatched up never heard of this term family regulation system. But Dorothy Roberts, who penned about 20 years ago an incredible monograph called Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, did us a lot of favors when she came up with this phrase and what it indicates and gestures to. But I just wanted to pause for a moment on the language here and share a few anecdotes. So one is that when I first went to write the piece that inspired this talk called by the same name for the Columbia Law and Race Journal on their symposium for the abolition of the child welfare system, a friend of mine, Black woman who's a computer scientist, she was giving me some advice and she was like, yo, what you should do is you should start the story with that, with the story about the white teacher who called the police on the kid during a Zoom call because she saw him with a Nerf gun. And then you have this emotional hook where then you can kind of canonize your example of automated decision-making systems that produce bias in this very particular system. And there were several reasons I decided not to do this, but I found the articulation of this impulse insightful because it points to this marketplace of ideas that incentivize us to kind of like diversify the souvenirs of lynchings, offering access to limited edition Black suffering as spectacle because the market is already saturated with so many viral videos of police murdering Black adults. This could quench the desire to linger on younger victims and niche perpetrators. Maybe YouTube would even sponsor caseworker body cams incentivized by the anticipation of viral engagement. And all to say that There's a series of reasons why I refuse to engage in the pseudo-confessional listing of the Family Regulation Systems Act of Violence, including that the one we must most desire to engage with, the system calls removal, but at least since 45's tenure on the border, most referred to as separation, is not the model encounter of the child welfare system, and for that matter, of the criminal justice system. But the primary reason is I'm not convinced that anyone in this audience needs this listing to understand how the family regulation system is a horror show. One more anecdote is that I'm first generation. For those of you who are of the children of immigrants, imagine how my Ethiopian family responded to my out of wedlock teenage pregnancy, plus going on to have 4 more kids, partnerless, perpetual poverty, refusal to adhere to the script for upwardly mobile citizenship. That said, almost all of my first cousins are Ivy League graduates. And while I was smoking weed, they were getting up at the crack of dawn to go to the free SAT prep on Saturday mornings in middle school, right? The point being that the majority of people who are in this audience today likely have not activated your personal or professional social network to access the plethora of resources on offer from the family regulation system. If ACS, New York City Administration of Children's Services, or your local child protective services was the site of something desirable, you here today would know, because like how we can see with the vaccine distribution, people will find a way to access that which is like materially beneficial to them. And the last example is my son goes to an incredibly racist and ableist public school in New York City. They refer to schools like this as the best school in the district or the most elite middle school in the city. I could never figure out if the picture I passed in the hallway of the only other Black child was there for posterity, or there actually is a second Black child who attends the school. What I do remember was the seemingly infinite rainbow flags that read Black Lives Matter, no human being is illegal. You see what I mean, right? If there was some material benefit from being on the receiving end of the family regulation system, white middle-class people, immigrants aspiring for upward mobility would be leveraging whatever they could gain access to, just like good or the best schools. And so when this system articulates itself as the child welfare system, this often like pushes the conversation to address like, how can we reimagine child safety? What is a restorative justice approach to child sexual trauma or abuse? And those are legitimate, valid questions. And when I'm saying we need to abolish the child welfare system, I do not mean that we need to deny the existence of violence in families. I'm also not an anarchist or a libertarian opposed to the involvement of the state in the private lives of families. What I'm trying to say is that when we move to respond to the signifier, the title child welfare system, in which this particular mode of policing likes to self-identify, we're moving away from looking at this infrastructure designed to produce benefit and profit for some at the expense of others. So in this talk, I'd like you to decouple the rhetoric of this system from its function and design. To clarify, the point is not hypocrisy. It's a plea to remove the veil of its branding to see the infrastructure of the family regulation system. Also, don't worry about my son. He starts a private school for disabled children next week. All kids in this country have a legal right to a free and appropriate education. But the Department of Education has created a cottage industry of neuropsychologists, special education attorneys, and advocates to sue the school boards for denial of that right and payment of private tuition. And the new school is like Harkness seminar style, not like the behavior modification isolation rooms that I graduated from and continue to exist to this day. And also just shout out to ProPublica because they did a great investigative series on that. Oh, and I just wanted to show you guys. So the origin of my academic career, actually, so when my youngest child went to childcare, I used to live on Roosevelt Island, which is this incredibly small racist town. And I used to say that it was like a microcosm for the rest of the country. And because what was interesting about it was not that it was racist, but that it only had one street, or has one street, Main Street. And anyway, I organized all of them in our local community theater to come see Get Out. And I really have been thinking about how horror movies capture our desires and our anxiety. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of prior to this had made this point about like, a lot of movies feature white people's anxiety of Black people, but that doesn't give us an ability to see Black people's anxiety of white people. But I argue that like petty is a politics. And so the desire that was really encapsulated in this event, in this movie, was that as my entire town, all, you know, the African Japanese parent network, the white middle class people, professors at Cornell Tech University, people who were living in the Section 8 housing, were in this theater. I was watching them. And so when we're like navigating this like liberal permissiveness, where we're constantly told that everything is diversity, that they're so happy to have us, and they're like violently gaslighting us and invalidating our existence and our ideas, that it is extremely comforting to then experience the inverse of that. And just there's not always a lot of like positive moments, but anyway, my point, if you see what I'm saying, is like petty is a politics. Okay. And just to reference, oh yeah, thank you. I wanted to show some of the books that kind of informed this presentation, because I know in the moral collapse of AI ethics, I was like, let's evolve the starter pack. And it's not to like reject or dismiss at all Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin, or The Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble. I think that they're fantastic, but they're part of this larger conversation. And one of the things that's important to me is that I read a lot. So when I was in these behavior modification centers, reading and writing is contraband. And so it's, you know, something that personally important to me is, now that no one can prevent me from having access to books, I read them frequently. But all to say that I just wanted to share what inspired this, and they're kind of organized by section. So if you look towards the bottom, these are some of the legal texts that inspired me, and then thinking about how these legal medical systems work together, and then also the tech part and the theoretical framework. Okay. So I wanted to start with, you know, I am a child welfare system abolitionist, but I think that in order to abolish or displace the system, you have to be able to fully identify the continuum on which it exists. And so when this article came out in the New York Times, Foster Care as Punishment, the New Reality of Jane Crow, it felt like a big deal in the midst of like total absence of coverage on the child welfare system. And it really highlighted how Black people and lower income people in New York City in particular are disproportionately targeted and investigated by the New York City Administration of Children's Services. I don't know how many people can see the text that's beneath the picture, but it says, Maisha Jo Field briefly lost custody of a child who wandered away while she was taking a bath. And, you know, the point being that like white families, I mean, think about Home Alone was a blockbuster film. And for what was depicted in that film, you could be going to jail if you are a Black person in New York City who comes in contact with the child welfare system. Simultaneously, this piece by Larissa Farquhar came out in the New Yorker asking, when should a child be taken from his parents? And the reason why I'm showing both of these two pieces is because they highlight one specific aspect of the child welfare system that most people focus on, and that is Child Protective Services, which is investigating an allegation and potentially removing that child from their family and placing them into care, which could be a foster home, a group home, a detention center. But both the New York City ACS and child welfare in general has a huge continuum of different things that compose it. And so, for example, this is inside Crossroads Juvenile Detention Center in Brownsville, Brooklyn. This facility is similar to Horizon, which I'll show you a picture of here. That's Brooklyn. This is in the Bronx. And the reason why this is important as we're thinking about abolition in this current political era is that when Rikers Island, when the Raise the Age law passed and 16 and 17-year-olds could no longer be detained at Rikers Island, they came under the jurisdiction of the New York City Administration of Children's Services. And this holds true in many areas of the country. And so it's just to think about something, if we don't fully understand how these systems operate, we can fight for changes that seem just, but in reality are just changing the agency that is monitoring the containment and detention of children into cages. And so as we're thinking about the family regulation system, there's like two important pieces that I want you guys to hold is geography. So I want you to think when we're mentioning these various services, where does it exist in space? How does it move people through space and time? And the second part is like, what is the actual function of this service? So even if it's called prevention or therapy, what is it actually performing? What does it do to people? And so let's see. And this is just to review again, like this is not even all encompassing. We're looking at protective services, detention centers, childcare vouchers, residential facilities, foster care, drug treatment. And I just wanted to give one example about how regulation works through childcare. And so it says vouchers and daycare. So what that means is that New York City ACS both runs daycare facilities and they distribute vouchers that can be used for families to pay for their childcare options. And so looking at this graph here, and so one of the things that I realized, because I both have been on the receiving end of New York City Administration of Children's Services case, but I've also been on welfare, have been in the shelter system. And so I think a lot of times as researchers or even as organizers or people thinking about public policy, we focus on one system, but most people have multi-system involvement. And it's important to see how those systems work together in order to regulate families. And so how do you access childcare vouchers? Often it's through TANF. TANF stands for Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And so that's otherwise known as welfare, the cash supplement that you're receiving. And so I found that in theory, if you look or you call like our 311, it says that, if you are a working family, you can get this voucher to pay for childcare. But in practice, there is a waiting list that is infinite if you are working. But if you're on welfare and you say, I am not working, and in order to attend the mandated work program, you automatically get a childcare voucher. And so thinking about abolition, let's think about when Clinton ended or abolished welfare as we knew it. Part of what that meant was people had to work for their welfare benefits and be spending, I believe it's 35 or 37 hours a week engaged in some kind of work activity. And so part of that is called work experience program. And so that's the part out of that 35 hours, half of it is usually spent going to some kind of center where they're teaching you how to write resumes or largely just like sitting there. But the WEP is people have to work up to 20 hours a week for their welfare benefits. And for a family of two, that comes out to something like 37 cents an hour. And so a lot of these childcare centers that take the voucher, because the voucher pays significantly below market rate, right? So like your private daycare that maybe if you're at a university and you're a professor that you might send your kid to, if you are on welfare, you do not have access to those places, generally speaking, because they do not take this voucher, which pays below market rate and late all the time. And so the other aspect is not just who sends their kids there, but how those daycare centers actually subsidize their own work. They often employ people who are working for the work experience program. So you have kids that are being sent because their parent has but no choice to participate in this working for your own welfare benefits. And then the daycare center itself is also being staffed in part by people who are working for like 32 cents an hour to work for their welfare benefits. And so, the last part is motivation to send your kid in the first place. Why do you even do this? Is that part of these work requirements, it varies from state by state. I believe in New York City, it's around 7 weeks. And so when we're thinking about how does regulation work in the family regulation system, it's easy to focus on separation. And I don't mean to minimize that at all, but we also have to think about the safe sleep program, the way childcare happens. How is it moving people and families across space and time? I just wanted to show a quick chart. This is from MAPS, which is from the OCFS handbook. OCFS stands for the Office of Child and Family Services for the state of New York. And I found this really helpful to understand how race was being classified in these data sets because it's done so very bizarrely. And I just wanted to share this with you guys because at some points you might hear me say like Hispanic or Latino, even though probably if I was just speaking to you directly, I would want to understand that a lot of people don't identify with these terms. But I wanted to accurately describe the data as it is produced by these systems. All right, so with that said, every time a familial bond is shattered, it's a tragedy. I should put this here. Caseworkers are police officers under another name, intruding into the intimate spaces of Black families, strip searching all children in the home, demanding entry without a warrant, No Miranda rights are read, no attorney is appointed at the onset of an investigation. The image of officers of the state intruding into the home, claiming their presence as care, separating Black families for their own safety is not analogous to plantation logics. It's the evolution of it. And so, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, there we go. The passage of the 1997 Adoption and Safe Families Act, or ASFA, expedited the termination of parental rights, TPR, for children removed into foster care, producing generations of legal orphans. Black children are most likely to have their parents' rights terminated, most likely to languish in care without adoption once the rights are terminated, most likely to be living in a congregate care setting, most likely to experience multiple foster boarding home placements. And what you're looking at now is the circulation of classified advertising, children in foster care rendered legal orphans through ASFA for adoption. And I feel like this really embodies the simultaneous discarding and commodifying of children who come into care. And so this is like an actual tweet from the Office of Children and Family Services. I tried to redact most of it because I think that the image is important, but I also at the same time don't want to further perpetuate the dehumanization of this child that they depicted. In order to understand the impact of the height of family separations, the impact that family separations continues to have on the present, it's important to remember that the 50,000 children who were in foster care in 1996 are now between 25 and 46 years old. The number one predictive factor for a child being investigated by Child Protective Services, and this was also true with the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, is the mother in particular being a child who had a foster care, was either placed into foster care or part of a Child Protective Service investigation. Many survivors of the system find themselves aging out of foster care only to experience their children coming into the same deadly seas. The child welfare system is not biased. It is racist in the Ruth Wilson Gilmore sense of the word. Racism is a state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Pivoting on Gilmore's insights, we see the outlines of child welfare's cradle to the grave system, how it produces vulnerability, first through collective surveillance, separation, abandonment, and then imprisonment, disability, and death. To encounter the system is to see the wake. And so living in the wake of slavery is living in the afterlife of property, and living the afterlife of partus sequitur ventrum, that which is brought forth follows the womb, in which the Black child inherits the non-status, the non-being of the mother. The inheritance of a non-status is everywhere apparent now in the ongoing criminalization of Black women and children. And this is an excerpt from Christina Sharp's In the Wake, which I know a lot of people are engaging with now. And I just want to hold up that the introduction in which she's sharing part of her life story also includes a story of adoption. What's interesting about child protection investigations is that, similar to sub-felony enforcement, where a substantial number of actions terminate in a disposition that involves no jail time or criminal conviction, the majority of child maltreatment investigations do not result in removal. This is not to minimize that there are 7,600 plus children currently in New York City foster care, that the majority of them are Black from neighborhoods with the highest rates of arrest and COVID-19 related deaths. Rather, we ought to heed guidance from Issa Kohler-Hausman. Do I have that? Yes. Issa Kohler-Hausman, this is from Misdemeanor Land, on the value of understanding less visible consequences of policing. So she goes on to say, exclusively focusing on the historical and internationally unprecedented numbers of people in the United States puts into prison and jail cells understates the reach of the criminal justice system, and in some sense, misrepresents the model criminal injustice encounter. If we want to understand the precise ways in which the criminal justice system functions as a form of social control, we need to look beyond custodial sentences or even criminal convictions. So again, of the over 84,000 children were investigated by New York City ACS in 2019, and about 4% were removed from their families and placed into foster care. We must document the lower reaches of this carceral system, because exclusively focusing on removal to assess the function of child welfare produces an incomplete picture of how they operate. And if we take a closer look at the data in 2019, over 45,000 children were enrolled in preventive services. There are almost as many children enrolled in preventive services than were removed into foster care during the peak of family separations in the late 90s. This prevention services roster reflects more than 12% of all New York City families living in poverty. And this is without, by the way, having access to data disaggregated by race. And given the concentration of preventive services, enrollment in neighborhoods that are majority minority, the percentage of families who are poor and Black and Hispanic enrolled in prevention is likely much higher. And I just want to pause for a second because I'm also reading, and so I feel like it's kind of dense. But the overall point is that there's a very important layer. There's two layers. And the first layer is that child welfare is transitioning from a primarily removal-based foster care system, at least in New York City, to a primarily preventive services model of child welfare. And this is where it goes back to, we have to see how the system actually functions rather than the rhetoric, because preventing the separation of families is a very noble commitment for democratic governance, but we have to look at exactly what is happening here. And if you're only looking at separations, you're missing a big part of the picture. And, also probably minimizing exactly how those separations happen. The majority of child welfare investigations are for neglect, which is, a lot of people will say, is a codified form of, is a way of pathologizing poverty. The teacher calls child services because the kid comes in with clothes that are too small or shoes that don't fit. But I would argue that this in and of itself does not account for the racial disparities, particularly in New York. So Black children and Indigenous children are overrepresented nationally. But New York is unique in that it's almost exclusively Black. I mean, when you're looking at the percentages, and this is in every section of the system, whether you're looking at detention, limited secure placement, non-secure placement, residential centers, foster care, investigations, it's around, usually it says 66% Black and 23% Hispanic or Latino, depending if you're looking at state or city data. But again, with this very bizarre rubric that we looked at, it's also, I think it doesn't explain there, but in that system, Black and Hispanic are mutually exclusive. And so if a child says, I am Puerto Rican or speak Spanish, even if they are Black, like Afro-Dominicano or something like that, they are now counted as Hispanic. And so it's likely that we're undercounting the amounts of Black people. And so I've been really animated by why is it? How is it that Black people are overrepresented? And I think in the language of bias, that kind of leads us in the wrong direction because we're just looking at people's internal prejudices and motivations. And one of the things that I found was that so Asian Americans are barely represented in New York City foster care. And if you're looking at system involvement with the highest rate of child welfare investigations, like the shelter system, Asian Americans are also underrepresented. But as you move towards less policing forms of social benefits like Medicaid, you start to see them, but you do not have that same level of encounter with mandated reporters if your sole interaction is through a Medicaid clinic. Is when you start getting under more intensive forms of surveillance the moment that you're living in public housing, you're going in through the shelter system, or experiencing incarceration. 1 second. So there are two layers of prediction to understand in the family regulation system. The first is represented by algorithms claiming to predict the futures of a growing underclass. The second is represented by a transition to a prevention services model where families deemed at risk of imminent removal of their children into foster care are enrolled into the child welfare system surveillance. Predictive analytics is not just coding over the cracks in the foundations of the child welfare system. The differential response programs that child welfare departments in a number of states have adopted, sorting parents into risk categories, animates child welfare agencies' use of predictive analytics. Providing in-home services to those identified at low risk of maltreating their children and reserving more coercive forms of surveillance and foster care for parents rated high risk might seem like progressive policy on the surface. But as Dorothy Roberts points out in Digitizing the Carceral State, these dual track systems based on risk assessment can have precisely the opposite effect. sweeping into the carceral net low-risk individuals who previously would not have been on the government's punitive radar at all. Struggling parents who are targeted by automated models become subject to agency monitoring and therefore more vulnerable to losing custody of their children, even though they are unlikely to harm them. And the other aspect of this is that the 2018 Federal Family First Prevention Services Act financially incentivizes state child welfare agencies to transition from a primarily removal or separation-based system to a prevention services model. Again, while the Dunantis humanitarian language of prevention and support for the poor might sound alluring, beneath the rhetoric intervention, we see materially how a model labeled as prevention services actually functions. In the literal sense, preventing family separations is a noble commitment. However, why do families become separated by child welfare agencies or by ICE? Is it because they have not had the good fortune to be enrolled in the supervision of agencies who operate the foster care system? It's not immediately apparent in the banal language of the bill, but expanding data collection, risk assessments, and predictive analytics is central to predicting who needs prevention and guidance on FFPA implementation. I just want to be mindful of time, so I'm gonna like skim a little bit here. So let me think about what I want to say. So one to know is that child welfare is an agency that's opposed to its own inspection. There's a great piece in, I think also ProPublica by Joaquin Sapien about ACS's refusal to comply with FOIA requests. And more recently, Beryl Lipton from Muckrock had submitted a FOIA request for the algorithm and all of the data and contracts associated with ACS's use of predictive analytics. And ostensibly they refused and just gave a few redacted documents that like provided less information than what was publicly available, which makes it very difficult to figure out what the hell is predictive analytics in the child welfare system. And I have really tried to answer this from my friends and my comrades like Joyce McMillan, who's definitely like my soldier in arms. And I'm so grateful to have her in my life coming for ACS. And she often uses the term, we need support, not surveillance. But how does the surveillance actually work? How is it enacted and how does it function? And so part of the way that I have tried to approach this is looking at a transition from the former ACS Commissioner Gladys Carrion to the current David Hansel. And so just to give kind of a timeline here, in July 2016, DJ Patel, the chief data scientist for the Obama White House Office of Science and Public Technology, asked Gladys Carrion, the commissioner of New York City's vast child welfare administration, what she thought of using predictive analytics in her agency. Her answer was, it scares the hell out of me, inciting half nervous chuckles in the room. I think about how we are impacting and infringing on people's civil liberties, Carrion said. She added that she runs a system that exclusively serves Black and Brown families. I'm concerned about widening the net under the guise that we are going to help them. How can we use these tools to keep children and families and communities together? 5 months later, in the wake of the highly publicized murder of Zymir Perkins by his parents, despite multiple contacts with the New York City Administration of Children's Services, Carrion resigns. 1 second, because I am still a little bit disorganized. And so this tragic murder of Zymir Perkins was followed by what Richard Wexler describes as a foster care panic, or a surge in removals by local child welfare agencies subsequent to the high-profile death of a child. However, as Wexler points out, these media narratives omit that a child is more likely to be seriously injured or murdered while in foster care than with their parents, who most often come to the attention of child welfare agencies due to poverty. This is the double violence. First, separation from the family, and then placement into care, where children in custody of ACS frequently encounter new forms of abuse and abandonment. And this was the basis for a class action lawsuit filed in 2015. And as a result of this lawsuit, a consent decree was put into place with a requirement that an independent monitor be assigned to assess ACS's compliance with the guidance set forth in the decree. That same month, David Hansel becomes a new commissioner of ACS. And very importantly, a whole bunch of nonprofits agreed to become the monitor. And ACS says, no, we'll hire Kroll on an open contract that I think NBC broke that was like $850 an hour Kroll is a global investigative and risk management corporation selected by the state oversight of ACS, OCFS, as an independent monitor. And just like a side detour, Kroll is also one of the 2 agencies Harvey Weinstein hired to intimidate his accusers. So 8 months after Kroll is assigned, ACS hails the report in a press release saying, independent monitor shows the steps we have been taking are the right ones. And it's important to look whose risk is Kroll actually mitigating, responding to, and remediating. The report makes notable omissions of the extreme racial disproportionality, delayed permanency in the form of adoption or reunification, and complex developmental trauma it causes for children and families within the New York City child welfare system. What the Kroll report does dedicate a section to is praising ACS for using predictive analytics. And just to shortly summarize, they're looking at about 170 data points, including the number of prior ACS cases involved in the family, their various relationships to other city data systems. Let's see what's also important in here. And so Kroll recommends this improving this practice by changing interagency data sharing protocols, for example, between the ACS and the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, or into the New York Police Department, NYPD, because they say these additional data points could be used by ACS in combination with connections data, which is kind of the state data warehouse, to develop case management software, to develop additional predictive analytic models that would further identify factors that place families at risk. This would afford both ACS and the respective agency the opportunity to take correction proactively. This narrative assumes that the dangers to children and their families are located within them and their communities rather than in the carceral continuum of which ACS is a part of, producing conditions of unsafety through separation, surveillance, and investigation. It seeks access to data collected by the NYPD, but not data reflecting the frequency of which the NYPD murders and brutalizes Black children. It seeks data by the New York City Department of Homeless Services on the behavior of their family clients, but it does not seek to integrate data on the squalid conditions of the Department of Homeless Services family shelters, which jeopardizes the safety of children. It's clear that ACS's interest is in identifying adverse childhood experiences does not include the state-sanctioned violence that produces the most defining traumatic conditions for families finding themselves on the receiving end of these predictions. So what is the goal of the predictive analytic model? The Kroll report continues, and it says the goal of these predictive models is to provide enhanced services to high-need families rather than to identify children for removal from homes. This approach differentiates ACS's predictive analytic models from models used by some other child welfare agencies, which tend to see modeling as a means for screening cases and identifying children who may need to be separated, inevitably creating difficult questions about false positive rates the models produce. Long story short, they're talking about Allegheny Family, which was using the screening model to determine who was going to be separated. And I'm just going to scroll here. It's important to recognize that even in the most recent federal guidance on predictive analytics in the child welfare system, that algorithmic fairness is considered an intractable problem. So Julia Angwin et al. 2016 ProPublica investigation into North Point's Compass and its bias against Blacks is cited reflexively in the majority of literature surrounding ADS as an example of this unavoidable risk, including Ravi Shroff, who was one of the people who puts forward his paper and is sharing his research developing this predictive analytic model for ACS. And so the thing is, what's being highlighted in this passage from the Kroll report, and this is like the important distinction, is by articulating the purpose of the model away from identifying whose child should be removed to framing the output as the identification of high needs families for the provision of voluntary services, the agency can mitigate the public backlash associated with false positives. And highlighting this approach, Kroll is not differentiating ACS's use of safe measures as more accurate in predicting the likelihood of child maltreatment compared to software like Allegheny Family Screening Tool. It's also not claiming that ACS's predictive risk modeling seeks to answer a fundamentally different question. It's highlighting how the agency can evade the same intensity of public scrutiny or difficult questions about false positive rates the models produce through tying the algorithm's output to the provision of preventive services and decoupling it from family separations. And preventive services are a narrative feat in their own right. Imagine if Philip Morris ran a hospital dedicated to lung cancer. Child welfare agencies are going a step further and claiming to prevent the violence they enact through new services only they can provide, decreasing their rate of child separations in exchange for a massive expansion of community level surveillance. ACS predicts who they will prevent from being separated by themselves. And Ali, I have like tons, like 5 more pages left, but I feel like we got 5 more minutes left. So I don't know if you want to kind of take it from there. Oh, I would say the last thing, because, you know, if you have not watched Sorry to Bother You, you have not lived. And so shout out to Miriam, who inspired me on Twitter, because what I really love about the movie that white critics lambasted Boots Riley for is that it depicts voluntary incarceration. And that is like one of that and Misdemeanor Land are one of the few things that I have encountered that so accurately capture this direction that child welfare seems to be going into. And for example, right now, to get a child services case, typically people call into the SCR, this hotline, to report, you know, anonymously an act of abuse or neglect. It has recently launched a hotline where parents can call the services on themselves. And so we're really moving towards this voluntary form of incarceration. And, you know, to understand predictive analytics, you can't merely look at it as a tool that's just reproducing the garbage in, garbage out issue of the dirty data, but part of this larger infrastructure, ideology, and narrative that the agencies themselves are producing as they're moving to new modes of social control.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much for this talk. Yeah, I have so many thoughts. I guess Nena's also here. Nena, do you have any thoughts, like, while I sort of piece together which thing I want to say resonated with me first, or?
Clearly, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Khadijah. And I think, like Ali said, there's so much to unpack here. One thing I'd love to hear you expand on is part of what seems to drive you is your concern around how invisible this issue seems to the larger public. And also, I think back to when really there was a media firestorm around child separation at the borders, but I think going back to invisibility, separation within our borders has sort of escaped, you know, national attention. And so from your position, do you think that there's any way that systems or technology or data can be used towards a good outcome on this issue?
Yeah, thank you for all of that feedback. I mean, there's so much more to say, so I worry that it all makes sense in the absence of some of the things that I omitted. But I'll say, like, one general thing, I do waffle between optimism and despair. But I think that it's important for people. Sometimes I feel frustrated because everyone is so incredibly busy and Zooming, frankly, that it's very hard to get people's attention. And a lot of the people that I'm surrounded by are doing really good work. And I'm just like, look at this thing over here, especially people who are like a lot of the people that I look up to, frankly, in the Black studies, Latinx studies, critical theory, who just bring a level of attention and detail to questions of catastrophe and classification and epistemology that people with computer science training just don't have access to. But I think that it's important to remember that when we look back at history, people have been able to politically synthesize this whole picture, what has happened to them. They've been incarcerated and assassinated by the state. And the moment that we're in now, I feel like that's less as much of a concern. I mean, it's still a legitimate concern, but I think the bigger issue is the degree of segregation that we're all experiencing, and this profound, how that reflects in a very fragmented information science ecosystem. So what's really hard, I mean, I think on one level, the thing with the separation at the borders is that one, you know, there's like the unsympathetic victim issue. And so do we really value the lives of Black and Indigenous women who are disproportionately targeted by these systems? You know, there's also a whole aspect of disability that plays into here, who gets ensnared. And so, you know, I think part of it is empathy, but I also don't want to overemphasize that, because it's important to understand that if you are if you were in a neighborhood that's being investigated, you probably know 500 people were being investigated. If you are white in New York City particular, you probably have not even heard of this process. It's so unbelievable. And so I think that it is figuring out spatially how do we get people together to join together to exchange information so that the system is visible. And then I think the other concern with the algorithms is that, you know, frankly, if I'm speaking to somebody who's getting their kid snatched up, they worried about Miss Johnson at the door. I'm like, you taking my data, they taking my kid. Like, why do I care about this data? And so, you know, a lot of the conversations around privacy are so abstracted from people's lived experience. But I just wanted to say shout out to Free Radicals and Stop LAPD Spying. I really encourage y'all to check out their Instagram because they put together this infographic called Algorithmic Ecology. And it's so, so helpful because what they were looking at was Skid Row and Predpol, and they were expecting for the heat spots to be within the camp. And really what they found out was that they were around the border. And so what that showed is that it's a new form of enclosure. And so if you see a wall, you are going to say like, this wall should not be built. But if you don't see anything and you have this invisibilized form of enclosure, it's harder to resist. But once people see that part, it becomes less about math equations that you're trying to drag into a webinar about and more like something real in their life that they need to grapple with.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're at 6:30, so I want to give people, I want to be conscious of time, but thank you so much for such an amazing talk and for bringing a lot of this stuff together. Like Nancy says, like this has drawn a lot of connections together that like I just didn't have sort of like this vision to like see it all through this framing. And when you put it this way, it makes it really clear that there are like all of these. Yeah, I mean, one of the most salient thoughts that I had was that like there's this particular framing of like, for instance, like Child Protective Services or Child Welfare Services saying like, what are the metrics that they're going to use to evaluate themselves, and then they like go ahead and meet those metrics or meet those goals, and like making it impossible for or incredibly difficult for other people to investigate them, making it difficult for, I mean, like not to say nothing of the fact that like there's that like it's not just the removal of children from the homes, it's also all of the other stuff that's going on. It's all of the other things that these systems are doing that we're losing sight of, or that we're losing focus of, because we're fixated on like this extreme example and not noticing that like so many of these cases are the death of 1,000 cuts that we're putting lots of parents and families through. I want to thank you again.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that as of right now, today, 1 in 3 children under the age of 18 have been investigated by Child Services. That's national. So again, like racially, there's of course overrepresentation, but just to show at scale, and just that point that all of these systems are always experimented on the most marginalized and vulnerable communities so that they can generalize to the rest of the population. And we didn't have time to get into Ravi's paper, but like the big barrier that they identify is not having enough data. And so, you know, once you begin to understand what is the goal, you start looking at all the different ways that they're trying to expand the data with the goal of, they say they're not, but I mean, the ability to then make these predictions all over the entire population of New York City without needing a call, it becomes like a more lurking danger.
Yeah, that's a perfect place to end, I suppose. Thank you so much, Khadijah. And thank you everybody for coming and attending this talk. The recording will be available after in a couple of days for anybody who knows anybody who wasn't able to attend this talk. But once again, thanks everybody for coming and attending. And thank you, Khadijah, for this webinar.
I'm super grateful. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, goodbye, everybody. I'll go ahead and end the meeting now. Thanks again.
Thank you. Take care.